The church door groaned as it swung inward, releasing a breath of cold stone and candle wax into the frozen morning air. Beatrice Loomis stepped inside, her boots leaving wet prints on the ancient flagstones. She carried a bundle of fresh holly wrapped in brown paper, her contribution to the Christmas Day decorations. The postmistress of Ashworth-on-Fell believed in punctuality. She believed in order. And she believed that if you wanted something done properly, you arrived before everyone else and did it yourself. The nave stretched before her, gray and silent. Pale winter light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting muted colors across the empty pews. The great stone pillars rose into shadow. At the far end, the altar stood dressed in white cloth, waiting for the morning service. Everything appeared as it should. Almost everything. Beatrice paused. Her eyes had caught something. A thin line of golden light beneath the vestry door. The paraffin heater, still burning. She could smell it now, faint but unmistakable. Reverend Thomas Whitmore was not an early riser. In 4 years, she had never known him to arrive at St. Michael's before 8 o'clock. Yet someone had been here. Someone had lit that heater. And they had not turned it off. She set down her holly on the nearest pew and approached the vestry door. Her footsteps echoed in the empty church. Each step felt slower than the last. Beatrice, she told herself firmly, you are being ridiculous. He probably came back for something he forgot. Fell asleep in his chair. Happens to men his age. But her hand hesitated on the door handle. Reverend Whitmore, she called, her voice louder than she intended. It bounced off the stone walls and returned to her, hollow. Reverend, are you quite all right in there? No answer came. She knocked twice. The sound was sharp. Final. Reverend Whitmore, I am coming in. The vestry door was not locked. It swung open easily beneath her hand. The room was small and cluttered. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, stuffed with hymn books and service sheets. Choir robes hung in neat rows on a rail. A desk sat beneath the window, buried under papers, and beside it, the paraffin heater glowed orange, filling the space with warmth that felt wrong somehow. Too close. Too still. And there, in the chair behind the desk, sat Reverend Thomas Whitmore. His eyes were closed. His chin had dropped to his chest. His reading spectacles had slipped halfway down his nose, as if he had nodded off while working. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, palms down, fingers slightly curled. On the desk before him sat an empty sherry glass. A half-eaten mince pie on a small china plate. And an open Bible, its pages marked with a red ribbon. He looked, for all the world, like a man who had simply fallen asleep. But Beatrice Loomis had seen death before. She had seen it take her father in his armchair by the fire, peaceful as a Sunday afternoon. She had seen it claim her mother in the hospital at Leeds, fighting until the very end. She knew the particular stillness of a body that would never wake. The absence that filled a room when the spirit had departed. She did not scream. She did not cry out. Instead, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, her breath clouding in the warm air, and whispered a single word. Vicar. The word fell into silence and vanished. Beatrice turned and walked back through the nave. Not running. Beatrice Loomis was not the running sort. But moving with purpose. Moving with the terrible certainty of someone who knows exactly what must be done next. She pushed open the church door and stepped into the frozen morning. The village lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow. Smoke rose from chimneys. Curtains remained drawn. Christmas Day was just beginning, and no one yet knew that everything had changed. Her eyes found the cottage at the edge of the green. The one with the stone walls and the crooked chimney and the name carved into the gatepost. Foxglove Cottage. Where the doctor lived. Where the retired librarian was staying. She began to walk. Have you ever returned somewhere after years away and felt like a stranger in a place you once called home? Have you ever sensed that something was wrong before you could name it, before you could point to evidence, before anyone would believe you? A vicar dead on Christmas morning. An empty sherry glass. A half-eaten mince pie. And a village full of people with reasons to want him silent. By the end of this story, you will know who killed him. You will know why. And you will understand what it cost everyone involved. But the answer is not what you expect. This is Christmas at Foxglove Cottage. If you enjoy cozy mysteries with heart, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. New mysteries arrive every Sunday. Now, let us go back 3 days, to where this story truly begins. Foxglove Cottage, Ashworth-on-Fell. December 21, 1953. Margaret Holloway stood at the gate of Foxglove Cottage, her suitcase at her feet, and remembered. She remembered running through this garden as a child, chasing butterflies between the lavender bushes. She remembered sitting on the front step with her sister Dorothy, eating bread and jam while their mother hung washing on the line. She remembered the day she left, 26 years old, following her new husband William to London with nothing but a trunk and a heart full of hope. That was 36 years ago. She had been back perhaps a dozen times since. Quick visits. A few days here and there. Never long enough to truly settle in. Never long enough to feel like she belonged. Now William was gone. 6 years in the ground at Bromley Cemetery. And Margaret was 62 years old, retired from the library, alone in a flat that felt too large and too quiet. When Dorothy's letter arrived in November, she had read it 3 times before responding. "Come for Christmas," Dot had written. "Stay as long as you like. We have missed you, Margaret. I have missed you. The cottage is the same. The village is mostly the same. And I think you need to come home." Home. The word had felt strange in her mouth when she said it aloud. But here she was. The front door opened, and Dorothy appeared. She was 66 now, 4 years Margaret's senior. Her hair had gone completely gray, pinned in the same sensible bun she had worn since girlhood. She wore a woolen dress beneath a flour-dusted apron, and her hands were red from working dough. But her eyes were the same. Warm and knowing and slightly exasperated, exactly as Margaret remembered. "You're standing in the cold like a stranger," Dorothy said. "Come inside before you freeze." Margaret picked up her suitcase and walked through the gate. The sisters embraced in the doorway. Brief but fierce. Dorothy smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke and something that Margaret could not name but recognized immediately. "Home. You look thin," Dorothy said, pulling back to study her. "You look exactly the same." "Liar. I look old. We both look old. That's what happens when you stay away for years at a time." Dorothy took the suitcase from Margaret's hand. "Come into the kitchen. I've got mince pies in the oven and tea in the pot." The kitchen had not changed. The same scrub table. The same copper pots hanging above the stove. The same view through the window, looking out across the garden toward the church steeple rising against the gray sky. Margaret sat down heavily in a chair and let the warmth seep into her bones. "How was the journey?" Dorothy asked, pouring tea. "Long. The train from King's Cross was delayed outside Doncaster for nearly an hour. Something on the tracks. Probably sheep. There's always sheep on the tracks in December. The farmers let them wander." "Probably." Dorothy set a cup before her and sat down across the table. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a robin sang in the bare branches of the apple tree. "It's good to see you, Maggie," Dorothy said softly. She had not used that childhood name in decades. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Something she had been carrying for longer than she realized. "It's good to be seen." Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed her hand. 6 years, she said. 6 years since you visited. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us entirely." "I didn't forget. Margaret paused, searching for words that would not come. After William died, traveling felt impossible. Everything felt impossible. And then 1 year became 2, and 2 became 4, and suddenly it had been so long that I didn't know how to come back. You come back by getting on a train. Same as always. It's not that simple. No, Dorothy agreed. It never is. But you're here now. That's what matters. She rose and checked the mince pies through the oven door. Satisfied, she returned to her seat. The village will want to see you, she said. Everyone remembers the Holloway girls. You were quite famous, you know. The clever one who went off to London and became a librarian. They'll expect stories. I have very few stories. 40 years of organizing books and shushing children. Then make some up. That's what I do. Margaret smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle she had forgotten how to use. How is Henry? She asked. Henry is Henry. Puttering about in his shed, pretending to fix the wireless when really he's just avoiding my questions about what he wants for Christmas dinner. Dorothy's voice was fond. He'll be pleased to see you. He's been asking when you'd arrive all morning. And the village? You said in your letter that some things have changed. Dorothy's expression flickered. Just for a moment. A shadow crossing her face before the warmth returned. Some things, she said carefully. We lost the butcher last year. Young Tom Cooper moved to Sheffield for work. And the schoolteacher retired in September. They've sent us a new one from Leeds. Barely 25. No idea how to manage country children. And the church? The shadow returned. Longer this time. The church is fine. Reverend Whitmore is competent. There was a weight to that word. Competent. Margaret had spent 40 years cataloging and cross-referencing. She knew when someone was choosing their words too carefully. Competent, she repeated. He does his job. Gives his sermons. Visits the sick when he remembers to. Dorothy stood abruptly and busied herself at the stove. Henry will be pleased to see you. I should fetch him from the shed. Margaret watched her sister's back. The tension in her shoulders. The way she had changed the subject. Something was wrong in this village. Something Dorothy did not want to discuss. Margaret filed the observation away in the same mental cabinet where she had once catalogued overdue books and misplaced manuscripts. Old habits, it seemed, died hard. Henry Ashby appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots and carrying a tangle of copper wire. Margaret. You made it. He crossed the room and clasped her hands in his. Henry was 68 now, his hair gone completely white, his face lined with the evidence of a life spent caring for others. He had been the village doctor for nearly 40 years before retiring last spring. Margaret had always liked him. A steady, practical man who balanced Dorothy's occasional flights of worry with calm good sense. The trains were delayed, Margaret said. They always are. Sit, sit. Has Dot given you tea? Has she told you about the Christmas Eve service? Not yet. Henry settled into the chair beside her. Biggest event of the year in Ashworth. The Reverend has been planning it for weeks. Candles, carols, the children's nativity. Half the village will be there. Will you go? Wouldn't miss it. I've been volunteered to read the second lesson. Dot's on the flower committee. He grinned. You'll come with us, of course. It was not a question. Margaret found she did not mind. I'd like that. Good. Now, what's this I hear about mince pies? I could smell them from the shed. Dorothy produced a plate of golden pastries, and for a while, conversation turned to simpler things. The weather. The neighbors. The state of Henry's wireless, which had developed an alarming crackle that no amount of tinkering seemed to fix. But Margaret noticed the way Dorothy and Henry exchanged glances when they thought she was not looking. Small, weighted looks that suggested unspoken communication. Married couples developed a language of their own over the years. She and William had possessed one too, once upon a time. After dinner, they sat in the parlor by the fire. Henry had finally abandoned the wireless and settled into his armchair with a glass of whiskey. Dorothy was knitting something shapeless and green. Margaret sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly against the glass. "The village feels different," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Quieter than I remember." "Villages change," Henry said. "Young people leave. Old people die. The cycle continues." "It's more than that." Margaret turned from the window. "Something is troubling you both. I can feel it. And I would rather you told me now than let me discover it for myself." Dorothy's knitting needles paused. She looked at Henry. He looked back. "Maggie always could read a room," Dorothy said softly. "It's nothing for you to worry about," Henry said. "Parish business. Politics. The sort of petty disputes that happen in every small village." "What kind of disputes?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "There have been irregularities. With the church accounts. Money that should be there and isn't. It's been going on for some time, apparently." "Theft?" "Possibly. Probably." He stared into his whiskey. "Thomas Whitmore asked me to review the books last month." Quietly. He didn't want to cause a scandal without evidence. "And what did you find?" "Enough to worry him. Hundreds of pounds missing over the past 2 years. Small amounts at first, easy to overlook. Then larger sums. Who has access to the accounts?" "Only 2 people. Thomas himself and Edgar Finch. The church warden." Margaret remembered the name. Edgar Finch had been a young man when she left the village. Quiet. Serious. He had enlisted in the army at 18 and gone off to fight in the war. "Edgar came back different," Dorothy said, as if reading her thoughts. "The war changed him. Henry says it's common. Nightmares. Nerves. A fondness for drink that's become more than fondness." "You think Edgar has been stealing from the church?" "I don't know what to think." Dorothy's needles resumed their clicking. "I only know that Thomas was going to confront him. After Christmas. He wanted to give the man a chance to explain. Or confess." Margaret absorbed this information. Her mind was already working, sorting and categorizing, building a picture from fragments. "Does Edgar know he suspected?" "He must. Thomas is not a subtle man. And Edgar," Henry hesitated. "Edgar is not stupid. Damaged, perhaps. Desperate, certainly. But not stupid. Then he knows what's coming." "Yes." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. "Thomas Whitmore is not the man people think he is," Henry said quietly. "He keeps secrets. He protects people who perhaps should not be protected. And he judges those who perhaps deserve more grace. But that is not my secret to tell." Margaret filed this away too. Another fragment. Another piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. "I should not have told you any of this," Dorothy said. "It's not your concern. You're here to rest. To enjoy Christmas. Not to get tangled up in village politics." "Everything is my concern," Margaret said mildly. "It's an occupational hazard." Dorothy almost smiled. The next morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Margaret borrowed a pair of Dorothy's sturdiest boots and walked into the village, her breath pluming white before her. Ashworth-on-Fell was small even by Yorkshire standards. A cluster of grey stone houses arranged around a central green, with the church at one end and the post office at the other. The Lamb and Flag pub anchored the western corner, its windows already glowing with light against the short winter day. A few shops lined the high street. A grocer. A tea room. A chemist with a faded sign. Margaret walked slowly, reacquainting herself with the geography of her childhood. The bones of the place were familiar. The shape of the green. The angle of the church steeple. The way the lane curved toward the moors. But the details had shifted. New faces in old doorways. Different names above the shops. She was studying the display in the chemist's window when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be Mrs. Holloway." Margaret turned. A woman stood behind her, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, a basket over one arm. She was perhaps 52, with sharp features and sharper eyes that seemed to catalogue Margaret in a single glance. "I am." "And you are?" "Beatrice Loomis. I run the post office." She extended a gloved hand, and Margaret shook it. The grip was firm and brief. "Dot mentioned you were coming for Christmas. Said you were a librarian in London. Retired now." Beatrice tilted her head, studying her with undisguised curiosity. "You have the look of someone who notices things." It was an odd observation. Delivered with perfect matter-of-factness. "I spent 40 years organizing books," Margaret said carefully. "It teaches you to pay attention to details." "I imagine it does." "Well, Mrs. Holloway, if you need anything while you're here, stamps, parcels, or simply someone to answer your questions, the post office is just there." She pointed to a small stone building across the green. "I know everything that happens in this village. It's an occupational hazard." "So I've heard." Beatrice smiled. It did not quite reach her eyes. "I imagine you've heard a great deal already. The Ashbys are not known for keeping secrets." She adjusted her basket. "Enjoy your walk, Mrs. Holloway. And welcome back to Ashworth-on-Fell." She was gone before Margaret could respond, walking briskly toward the church with her basket swinging at her side. St. Michael's Church was older than the village itself. Norman in origin, with additions from every century since. The stone was grey and weathered, softened by centuries of Yorkshire rain. Margaret pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, grateful for the relative warmth of the nave. The interior was beautiful in a plain, English way. Whitewashed walls. Dark oak pews. A simple stone altar. Afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the flagstones in shades of blue and gold. Two figures stood near the altar, deep in conversation. Their voices carried in the empty space. "The accounts don't balance, Thomas." "I've checked twice." "Then check again, Edgar." "I won't have accusations thrown about on the basis of arithmetic errors." "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply saying that the numbers." "Enough." The taller man held up his hand. He wore clerical dress, his collar bright against the dark fabric of his shirt. "We will discuss this after Christmas. The parish has more important concerns at present." "More important than?" "I said enough." The shorter man, Edgar, stiffened. Margaret saw his hands clench at his sides. For a moment, something dark flickered across his face. Anger. Fear. Desperation. She could not tell which. Then it was gone, replaced by a neutral expression that fooled no one. "As you say, Reverend." He turned and walked down the aisle, passing Margaret with barely a glance. Up close, she could see the lines carved deep around his eyes. The slight tremor in his hands. The broken capillaries across his nose that spoke of too many nights with a bottle. He moved like a man carrying a weight too heavy to set down. The church door banged shut behind him. "Can I help you?" Margaret looked up. The Reverend had approached while she was watching Edgar leave. He was tall and thin, perhaps 67, with grey hair combed back from a high forehead and spectacles perched on a narrow nose. His smile was polite but distant. The expression of a man performing welcome rather than feeling it. "I'm Margaret Holloway. Dorothy Ashby's sister." Ah, yes. Dot mentioned you would be joining us for Christmas. He extended a hand. His grip was brief and cool. Thomas Whitmore. Welcome to St. Michael's. The church is beautiful. I remember coming here as a child, but it seems larger somehow. Places often do, when we return to them. The memory shrinks what the eye expands. He glanced toward the door through which Edgar had departed. I apologize if you overheard any unpleasantness. Parish business. Tedious but necessary. Of course. Will you be joining us for the Christmas Eve service? Your sister has been working very hard on the decorations. I wouldn't miss it. Excellent. We begin at 7 o'clock. I do hope the weather holds. He smiled again. That same polite, practiced smile. Then he excused himself, disappearing through a side door into what Margaret assumed was the vestry. She stood alone in the nave for a long moment. The candles flickered in the draught from the door. The stone walls seemed to lean inward, holding their secrets close. The vicarage stood beside the church, a handsome Georgian building with tall windows and a slate roof. Margaret had intended to walk past on her way back to Foxglove Cottage, but the front door opened as she approached, and a woman emerged, pulling on gloves. Oh. You startled me. I'm sorry. I was just admiring the house. The woman laughed. A surprisingly warm sound in the cold air. Don't apologize. I'm always startled. Nerves like a cat, Thomas says. She extended a hand. Constance Whitmore. You must be Dot's sister. Constance Whitmore was perhaps 64, with soft gray curls escaping from beneath a felt hat and kind eyes set in a round, pleasant face. Where her husband had seemed cool and distant, Constance radiated warmth. News travels fast, Margaret observed. In a village this size, news travels before it happens. Beatrice Loomis told me you'd arrived yesterday, and Mrs. Perkins confirmed it when she dropped off a fruitcake this morning. Constance smiled. Welcome to Ashworth-on-Fell. Thank you. I was just on my way to check on the flower arrangements for Christmas Eve. Would you like to walk with me? I imagine Dot's already at the church, wrestling with the holly. Margaret accepted, and they fell into step together, their boots crunching on the frozen path. How long are you staying? Constance asked. Through the new year, if Dot doesn't tire of me. She won't. She's spoken of nothing else for weeks. Constance affected a light tone. My sister Margaret is coming from London. My sister Margaret was a librarian. My sister Margaret knows everything about everything. She laughed again. I think she's quite proud of you. Margaret felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the cold. We haven't seen each other often enough. Life gets in the way. Doesn't it just? Constance's voice softened. I've been meaning to visit my own sister in Bath, but there's always something. The parish. Thomas's health. One obligation after another. Perhaps after Christmas. Is the Reverend unwell? Nothing serious. His heart, the doctor says. He's to avoid excitement and rich food. She smiled ruefully. Not the easiest prescription to follow at Christmas. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. The church steeple rose ahead of them, dark against the gray sky. May I ask you something? Margaret said. Of course. Your husband seems troubled. I noticed it when I spoke with him in the church. Is something wrong? Constance's step faltered. Just slightly. Then she recovered. Thomas is always troubled. It comes with the job, I suppose. The burdens people bring to him. The confessions. The secrets. She was quiet for a moment. He keeps things from me. He thinks he's protecting me. But silence is not protection, Mrs. Holloway. It's distance. The words hung in the air between them. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I didn't mean to pry. You didn't. You asked a question. Most people in this village are too polite to ask questions. Constance stopped walking and turned to face her. I love my husband. But sometimes I feel I don't know him at all. And that is a lonely thing, after 40 years of marriage. Margaret understood. She understood more than she could say. Marriage requires honesty to survive, she said quietly. Without it, two people can live in the same house for decades and still be strangers. Constance studied her face. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The shared knowledge of women who had learned hard truths about love. Yes, Constance said. Exactly that. They had reached the church. Through the open door, Margaret could see Dorothy standing on a stepladder, arranging ivy along a windowsill. There's my taskmaster, Constance said, her voice deliberately lighter. I'd better help before she pulls down the whole display. She squeezed Margaret's hand. It was lovely meeting you, Mrs. Holloway. Margaret, please. Margaret. Constance smiled. I hope you'll come to the vicarage for sherry after the Christmas Eve service. Just a small gathering. The Ashbys, Edgar Finch, Beatrice. Nothing formal. I'd like that. Constance smiled once more, then hurried into the church to join Dorothy. Margaret stood alone on the path, thinking. Edgar Finch lived at the edge of the village, near the path that led up onto the moors. Margaret found his cottage by asking at the post office, enduring Beatrice's pointed questions about why she wanted to know. The cottage had the look of a place whose owner had stopped caring. The paint was peeling. The garden was overgrown with dead weeds. No Christmas wreath hung on the door. No lights burned in the windows. Margaret knocked and waited. The door opened. Edgar stood in the gap, unshaven, wearing a stained jumper and trousers that had seen better days. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he smelled faintly of whiskey. You're the librarian, he said. Dot's sister. I am. What do you want? To talk. About what? About what I overheard in the church this morning. Something shifted in his face. Fear, quickly suppressed. Replaced by defiance. That's none of your business. Perhaps not. But I'm curious by nature, Mr. Finch. And I've found that people often want to talk, if someone is willing to listen. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back, opening the door wider. You'd better come in, then. The cottage was barely warmer inside than out. No fire burned in the grate. The furniture was minimal. A table with 2 chairs. A sagging armchair. A wireless set that probably hadn't worked in years. Empty bottles stood on the table, and the whole place smelled of damp and neglect. Edgar sank into the armchair and gestured vaguely toward the other chair. Margaret sat. So, he said. You want to hear my side of it? If you're willing to tell me. He laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. Why not? Everyone else has already decided I'm guilty. Might as well tell someone the truth before they cart me off to prison. I haven't decided anything, Mr. Finch. I'm simply trying to understand. He studied her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. I served in the war, he said. Did Dot tell you that? She mentioned it. North Africa. Then Italy. Then France. He stared at his hands. 3 years of watching men die. Friends. Boys I'd grown up with. Blown apart or burned alive or shot through the head. His voice was flat. Distant. I came home in 45. Everyone said I was lucky. A hero. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a ghost. Margaret said nothing. Sometimes listening was the kindest thing you could do. The drinking started after the war. Just a little at first. To help me sleep. To stop the dreams. He laughed again, without humor. Then it became more than a little. And then I started gambling. Cards, mostly. Horses. Anything to feel something other than numb. And you lost. I lost everything. My savings. My reputation. My self-respect. He met her eyes. And then I started taking money from the church. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of lying. And because you're the first person who's bothered to ask instead of assume. He rubbed his face with both hands. I told myself I'd pay it back. Just a little at a time. No one would notice. But the debts kept growing, and the amounts I took kept growing, and now. He broke off. Now the Reverend knows. Yes. He's known for months, I think. He was just waiting for the right moment to confront me. After Christmas, he said. As if that makes it kinder. What will you do? Edgar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. I have nothing left, Mrs. Holloway. No money. No family. No future. He looked at her with eyes that held no hope. Thomas is going to destroy me. He'll report me to the bishop. To the police. My name will be in the papers. Everyone I've ever known will see what I've become. And you cannot let that happen. The words hung in the air between them. Heavy. Dangerous. I am not a bad man, Edgar said. I made bad choices. But I am not a murderer, if that's what you're thinking. I wasn't thinking anything, Mr. Finch. I was simply listening. He stared at her. Then he nodded slowly. You should go. It's getting dark, and the path back to the village is treacherous when you can't see. Margaret stood. One more question. Where were you planning to be on Christmas Eve? At the church. The service. Then the vicarage for Sherry. Same as every year. His mouth twisted. Thomas likes to keep his enemies close. And I am too much of a coward to stay away. She let herself out into the cold evening air. As she walked back toward the village, she thought about what she had heard. About desperation. About shame. About a man with nothing left to lose. And she wondered what a man like that might do when his back was against the wall. Christmas Eve morning dawned gray and heavy. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the village in white, and more was promised by afternoon. Margaret woke early, dressed in warm layers, and found Dorothy already in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. You're up with the birds, Dorothy said without turning around. Couldn't sleep. Thinking about something? Margaret poured herself a cup of tea from the pot on the stove. I visited Edgar Finch yesterday. Dorothy's hands paused in the dough. Then resumed their rhythm. Did you now? He told me everything. The gambling. The debts. The money he's been taking. And what did you think of him? Margaret considered the question carefully. I think he's a man who made terrible choices because he was in terrible pain. And I think he's terrified of what's coming. He should be. Dorothy shaped the dough into a loaf and covered it with a cloth. Thomas is not a forgiving man. He'll see Edgar ruined. Does that seem right to you? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what's right anymore, Maggie. Edgar stole from the church. From all of us. That money was meant for roof repairs. For the poor fund. For keeping the building standing another 100 years. She wiped flour from her hands. But I also remember Edgar as a boy. Quiet. Gentle. Always bringing injured birds to Henry to patch up. The war took something from him that he never got back. So what happens now? Thomas confronts him after Christmas. There's a meeting of the parish council scheduled for the 27th. Edgar will be asked to resign. To repay what he can. And if he can't, she shrugged. Police, probably. Prison, possibly. Either way, his life here is over. Margaret stared out the window at the falling snow. Someone should warn him. Warn him of what? He already knows. He's been waiting for this for months. Then someone should help him. Help him how? The money's gone, Maggie. Spent on drink and gambling. There's no putting it back. I wasn't talking about money. Margaret turned from the window. I was talking about compassion. About giving someone a chance to make amends instead of just punishing them. Dorothy's expression softened. You always did have a soft heart. Even as a girl. Bringing home stray cats and arguing with father about second chances. And you always did have a practical one. We balance each other. That we do. Henry appeared in the kitchen doorway, pulling on his cardigan. I smell bread. And plotting. What have I missed? Nothing important, Dorothy said. Tea. Please. They sat together at the kitchen table, the three of them, while the snow fell outside and the clock ticked toward evening. Margaret caught Henry's eye. I think something is going to happen tonight, she said quietly. Henry set down his cup. What makes you say that? Call it instinct. Edgar is desperate. Thomas is determined. And desperation combined with determination rarely ends well. What do you suggest we do? Watch. Listen. And be ready. Henry studied her face for a long moment. You know, he said slowly, when Dot said you notice things, I thought she was exaggerating. I see now that she was understating. It's what I do. Or what I did. Old habits. Then let's hope those habits serve you well tonight. He picked up his tea again. Because I have a feeling you may be right. By evening, the snow had stopped, and the village emerged from its cottages like figures stepping out of a Christmas card. Margaret walked to the church with Dorothy and Henry, their boots leaving 3 sets of prints in the fresh powder. The nave was transformed. Candles flickered in every window and along every pew, casting a warm golden glow over the congregation. Holly and ivy wound around the pillars. A modest nativity scene had been arranged near the altar, with painted wooden figures that Margaret remembered from her own childhood. Mary and Joseph. The baby in the manger. Shepherds with their crooks. Wise men bearing gifts. The pews were full. Margaret saw familiar faces, older now, changed by decades. And unfamiliar faces too. The village had grown and shifted while she was away. Beatrice Loomis sat in the 3rd row, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. She nodded at Margaret as they passed. A small acknowledgement. Almost friendly. Constance Whitmore occupied the front pew, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. She looked beautiful in the candlelight. Peaceful. Whatever worries she carried had been set aside for this holy night. And in the back row, almost hidden in shadow, sat Edgar Finch. He was pale. His hands, resting on the hymnal in his lap, trembled slightly. He did not look up as Margaret passed. He stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, lost in thoughts she could only imagine. At precisely 7 o'clock, Reverend Thomas Whitmore emerged from the vestry and took his place at the pulpit. Welcome, he said, his voice carrying through the candlelit space, to St. Michael's Church, on this most holy of nights. The service unfolded as Christmas Eve services always do. Familiar readings from ancient texts. Beloved carols sung by voices young and old. The children's nativity, with its attendant chaos of forgotten lines and crooked halos and one small shepherd who burst into tears and had to be comforted by his mother. Henry read his lesson in a clear, steady voice. Isaiah, chapter 9. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. Dorothy watched from the pew with an expression of quiet pride. And Margaret watched Edgar. He sat rigid, his hymnal unopened, his lips unmoving during the carols. Twice she saw him glance toward the Reverend with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear, perhaps. Or resentment. Or some complicated mixture of both. During the final carol, "Oh, come all ye faithful," she saw him slip out through the side door. The congregation sang on, oblivious. Margaret leaned close to Dorothy. "Where did Edgar go?" Dorothy looked toward the back pew. "Empty now." "I don't know. Perhaps he felt unwell." "Perhaps." But Margaret didn't believe it. Not for a moment. The service ended at 8:30. The congregation filed out slowly, exchanging greetings and good wishes, the cold night air sharp after the warmth of the candlelit nave. "Sherry at the vicarage," Constance reminded them at the door. "Do come. Thomas will be along shortly. He just needs to extinguish the candles." Margaret followed Dorothy and Henry across the snowy churchyard toward the vicarage. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more mystery lovers find Harbolite mysteries. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. The mystery is just getting started. The vicarage parlor was warm and bright. A fire crackled in the hearth, and lamps glowed on every surface. Constance had laid out sherry, mince pies, and small sandwiches on a sideboard beneath the window. Margaret accepted a glass of sherry and settled into a chair near the fire. The room was crowded but comfortable. Dorothy and Henry stood by the mantelpiece, talking quietly with an elderly couple Margaret didn't recognize. Beatrice Loomis held court near the Christmas tree, entertaining a small group with what sounded like village gossip. The Reverend had not yet arrived. Margaret sipped her sherry and observed. It was what she did best. Watch. Listen. Catalog details that others overlooked. Constance moved through the room, refilling glasses, offering sandwiches, playing the perfect hostess. But Margaret noticed the way her eyes kept drifting toward the window. Toward the church. Waiting. The door opened, and everyone turned. Edgar Finch stepped into the room. The atmosphere shifted immediately. A subtle tightening. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Smiles became fixed. "Edgar," Constance said warmly, seemingly oblivious to the tension. Or perhaps choosing to ignore it. "We thought you weren't coming. Let me get you some sherry. I won't stay long." His voice was hoarse. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, his coat still buttoned, his hat clutched in both hands. "I just came to say," he stopped. Swallowed. His eyes swept the room, landing on each face in turn. "Happy Christmas." "Happy Christmas," the room murmured back. Polite. Distant. The response of people who did not know what else to say. Edgar stood there for a moment longer. Then he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Silence. Then Beatrice said something about the weather, and the conversations resumed, slightly strained but determined to continue. "Poor man," Constance said softly, to no one in particular. "He hasn't been himself lately." Margaret caught Henry's eye across the room. He shook his head slightly. "A warning. Not here. Not now." The front door opened again. This time, it was the Reverend. Thomas Whitmore entered the room, bringing cold air with him. He was still wearing his vestments, his clerical collar bright against the dark fabric. His face was pale, and there were circles under his eyes that had not been there that morning. "Forgive my tardiness," he said. "The candles took longer to extinguish than I expected." "You work too hard," Constance said, taking his arm. "Sit down. I'll bring you some sherry." "No. Thank you." He gently disengaged from her grip. "I need to return to the church. I left my reading glasses in the vestry." "Thomas, it's nearly 9. I won't be long. Just a few minutes." He was already moving toward the door. Constance followed him into the hallway. Margaret could hear their voices, low and urgent. "Must you go now?" "The guests." "I said I won't be long." "You're exhausted. Can't it wait until morning?" "No. It cannot." The front door opened and closed. Cold air swept through the parlor. Constance returned, her smile firmly in place. But Margaret had seen the look that passed between husband and wife in that moment. Frustration on her side. Something harder to read on his. The party continued. Sherry was drunk. Mince pies were eaten. Carols were sung around the piano, slightly off-key but full of good cheer. Margaret stood by the window, watching the church. A light burned in the vestry window. A single golden glow against the darkness. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The Reverend did not return. The party at the vicarage broke up around 10 o'clock. Margaret walked back to Foxglove Cottage with Dorothy and Henry, their breath fogging in the frozen air. Strange evening, Henry remarked. Edgar looked terrible, Dorothy agreed. I've never seen him so pale. And the Reverend, Margaret added. Did he seem worried to you? Dorothy and Henry exchanged a glance. Thomas Whitmore always seems worried, Henry said carefully. It's his natural state. Comes with the job, I imagine. But tonight was different. Something happened between him and Edgar. Something beyond what you told me before. If something happened, Dorothy said firmly, it's not our business. Come inside. It's too cold to stand here speculating. Margaret followed her sister into the cottage. But she did not go to bed. She sat in the armchair by the window, a blanket across her knees, watching the village sleep. The church was dark now. The light in the vestry had gone out. Snow fell steadily, covering the footprints on the green, erasing the evidence of all the comings and goings. Dorothy and Henry retired around 11. Margaret heard them moving about upstairs, the creak of bed springs, the murmur of their voices. Then silence. The fire burned low. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Margaret could not sleep. Her mind kept turning, sorting, cataloging. The fragments of the puzzle arranging and rearranging themselves. Edgar's desperation. The Reverend's anxiety. The missing money. The confrontation planned for after Christmas. And tonight, of all nights, the Reverend had rushed back to the church. Alone. Why? To retrieve his glasses, he said. But his glasses had been on his face during the party. Margaret was certain of it. She had noticed them when he entered, perched on his nose exactly where they always sat. So why the lie? She stared out the window at the church. Dark and silent against the sky. The steeple barely visible through the falling snow. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. That prickling sensation she had learned to trust over 40 years of noticing what others missed. Something had happened tonight. Something was happening still. And by morning, everything would be different. The clock struck midnight. Christmas Day. Margaret whispered into the darkness. Something is wrong. She did not know how right she was. The pounding came like thunder. Margaret was out of bed before her eyes fully opened. Her feet hit the cold floor. Her heart slammed against her ribs. That kind of knocking meant only one thing. Something terrible had happened. She grabbed her robe and ran for the stairs. Dorothy was already at the front door, Henry close behind, pulling on his cardigan with shaking hands. Dorothy opened the door. Beatrice Loomis stood on the doorstep. Snow clung to her hair. Her face was the color of ash. Her chest heaved like she had been running, and Beatrice Loomis never ran. Not for anything. Not for anyone. Until now. Beatrice, what on earth? He's dead. 2 words. Flat. Final. They fell into the cottage like stones dropped into still water. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. Henry went rigid. Margaret pushed forward. Who? Who is dead? Beatrice's eyes found hers. And in that moment, Margaret saw something she had never expected to see in those sharp, knowing eyes. Fear. The Reverend Thomas Whitmore. Beatrice's voice cracked. I found him in the vestry. Sitting in his chair. Cold as the stone floor beneath him. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Henry grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. Show me. They ran. Margaret had not run in years. Her lungs burned. Her legs ached. But she ran, because something in Beatrice's face told her that every second mattered. That whatever had happened in that vestry, it was not finished. It was not over. The church door stood open. A wedge of golden light spilling onto the snow. They burst inside. The nave was cold. The candles from last night had burned down to stubs, leaving pools of hardened wax on the windowsills. The nativity scene stood undisturbed. Mary and Joseph watching over the empty manger with painted eyes that saw nothing. The vestry door was open. Henry went first. Then Dorothy. Then Margaret. Beatrice hung back, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wet with tears she was too proud to let fall. Margaret had seen death before. She had held William's hand as the light left his eyes. She had sat beside her mother in the hospital, listening to the machines beep slower and slower until they stopped altogether. She knew the stillness that came when the soul departed. But this was different. Reverend Thomas Whitmore sat in his chair like a man who had simply fallen asleep. His chin rested on his chest. His hands lay flat on the armrests. His reading spectacles had slipped down his nose, and his eyes were closed, peaceful, almost serene. But there was no peace in this room. Margaret felt it immediately. A wrongness that pressed against her skin like cold water. Something had happened here. Something beyond a tired old man succumbing to a weak heart. She forced herself to look. To observe. To catalogue. The paraffin heater glowed in the corner, filling the room with warmth that felt obscene against the presence of death. The desk was covered in papers. Sermon notes. Parish accounts. A Bible open to the book of Matthew, the page marked with a red ribbon. An empty sherry glass stood on the desk. Beside it, a small china plate with a half-eaten mince pie. Golden crumbs scattered across the wood. And the Reverend's spectacles. On his face. Perched exactly where they always sat. Heart attack, Henry murmured. He had knelt beside the body, his fingers pressed to the Reverend's wrist, his ear close to the still chest. That would be my preliminary assessment. Given his history. Given his condition. You're certain? Dorothy asked. Nothing is certain until we have a proper examination. But the symptoms are consistent. Henry stood slowly, his knees cracking. No signs of violence. No wounds. No bruising. Just a man whose heart gave out. On Christmas Eve, Beatrice said from the doorway. Her voice was strange. Hollow. In his vestry. Alone. People die alone every day, Dorothy said gently. It's sad, but it's not suspicious. Isn't it? Everyone turned. Margaret had spoken. She stood by the desk, her eyes fixed on the empty sherry glass. Isn't it suspicious? She repeated. A man leaves a party, claiming he forgot his glasses. But his glasses are on his face. He says he'll only be a few minutes. But he never returns. And now we find him dead, with an empty glass and a half-eaten pie, in a room that's been kept warm all night. What are you suggesting? Henry asked carefully. Margaret picked up the sherry glass. Held it to the pale morning light. There was residue at the bottom. A faint discoloration. Barely visible. The kind of detail most people would overlook entirely. But Margaret Holloway was not most people. I'm suggesting, she said slowly, that we might not be looking at a natural death. That's a serious accusation, Henry said. It's not an accusation. It's an observation. Margaret set the glass down carefully. But consider the facts. Edgar Finch has been stealing from this church for 2 years. The Reverend was going to expose him. Ruin him. Send him to prison. And Edgar knew it. Edgar wouldn't. Edgar told me himself that he couldn't let the Reverend destroy him. Those were his exact words. I cannot let that happen. Dorothy's face had gone pale. You think Edgar killed him? I think someone did. And Edgar had more reason than anyone. The vestry fell silent. Outside, the church bells began to ring. Christmas morning. The village waking to joy and celebration. Unaware that everything had changed. Henry looked at Margaret for a long moment. His face was troubled. Conflicted. The constable should be informed, he said finally. Peterson, from Lower Ashworth. I'll send word. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we tell no one what we suspect. Not until we have evidence. Not until we're certain. He looked down at the body of the man who had been his vicar, his neighbor, his friend. Thomas deserves that much. The truth. Whatever it may be. Margaret nodded. But in her mind, the pieces were already arranging themselves. The puzzle taking shape. And at its center, one question burned brighter than all the others. What was in that mince pie? Constance Whitmore had not moved from her chair in over an hour. She sat in the same spot where she had greeted guests the night before, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. The fire had burned down to embers. The Christmas tree lights had been switched off. The mince pies on the sideboard remained untouched, a cruel reminder of celebrations that would never come. Margaret sat across from her. Dorothy had gone to make tea. Henry was with the constable, answering questions, examining the body more thoroughly. He didn't come home, Constance said. Her voice was distant. Dreaming. I waited up until midnight. Then I told myself he must have fallen asleep in the vestry. He did that sometimes. When he was working on a difficult sermon. Did you consider going to check on him? I should have. I know I should have. Tears slipped down Constance's cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. But we'd argued. Before the party. About Edgar. About the money. About what he was planning to do. Margaret leaned forward slightly. What was he planning to do? Destroy him. Constance's voice hardened. Thomas wanted Edgar arrested. Publicly shamed. He said it was justice. That the parish deserved to know what their church warden had done. She shook her head slowly. But I saw his face when he talked about it. There was no justice in his eyes. Only satisfaction. Did Thomas have a personal grievance against Edgar? Constance was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. They were friends once. Before the war. Thomas was the curate here then, young and idealistic. Edgar was his closest confidant. They talked about everything. Faith. Doubt. The future. What changed? The war changed Edgar. And Thomas. Thomas couldn't forgive him for it. He saw Edgar's drinking as weakness. His gambling as sin. He believed that Edgar had chosen to fall, and he had no patience for people who made bad choices. Even when those choices came from pain. Constance looked at Margaret with eyes that held decades of disappointment. My husband was a good man in many ways. But compassion was not among his gifts. He saw the world in black and white. Right and wrong. Saved and damned. There was no gray in Thomas's gospel. And Edgar, her voice broke. Edgar was gray. All gray. And Thomas could never accept that. Dorothy appeared with tea. She set the cups down and sat beside Constance, taking her hand. Is there anything we can do? Dorothy asked. Anyone we should contact? My sister in Bath. She'll want to come. Constance stared at her tea without drinking it. I should feel more, shouldn't I? I should be wailing. Screaming. Tearing my clothes like the women in the Bible. But I just feel empty. Grief takes many forms, Margaret said gently. There's no right way to feel. I loved him. I want you to know that. Despite everything. Despite the distance between us. Despite the secrets. Constance finally met Margaret's eyes. But I did not know him. 40 years of marriage, and he was still a stranger to me. And now he's gone, and I'll never have the chance to truly understand who he was. Margaret reached across and touched Constance's hand. Perhaps, she said quietly, understanding comes after. Perhaps the truth reveals what love could not. Constance stared at her. You know something. Don't you? Something about how he died. Margaret hesitated. Then nodded. I suspect something. I don't know it yet. But I intend to find out. Will you tell me? When you know? Yes. I promise. Constance closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Then find the truth, Mrs. Holloway. Find it, and bring it to me. Whatever it is. Whatever it costs. I need to know. Digitalis. Henry spoke the word like a confession. He sat behind his desk, his face gray with exhaustion and something else. Something that looked like guilt. Explain, Margaret said. Thomas was taking digitalis for his heart condition. It's derived from foxglove. In small doses, it strengthens the heartbeat. Keeps the rhythm steady. But in large doses, it becomes poison. Exactly. The heart races uncontrollably. Then stops. Henry rubbed his face with both hands. It would look exactly like a natural heart attack. Almost impossible to detect without a thorough toxicology examination. Which the constable isn't going to order. No. Peterson is satisfied it was natural causes. He's already filed his preliminary report. Case closed, as far as he's concerned. Margaret stopped pacing. But you're not satisfied. No. Henry's voice was barely audible. That residue you noticed in the sherry glass. I tested it. Just a simple analysis, nothing sophisticated. But there was something in that drink. Something that shouldn't have been there. Margaret's heart pounded. Here it was. Confirmation of what she had suspected. The mince pie, she said. There was a half-eaten mince pie on his desk. Could the poison have been in both? Possibly. Digitalis has a bitter taste, but it could be masked by sugar and spices. A mince pie would be perfect. Henry looked sick. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Someone with access to foxglove. It grows wild on the moors. And in half the gardens in this village. Including, he stopped. Including what? Henry's eyes met hers. Including the garden behind Edgar Finch's cottage. I walked past it yesterday. The plants are dormant now, but the roots remain. And the roots contain the highest concentration of the toxin. Have you told anyone else? No. Just you. Henry stood and walked to the window. I should report this. I know I should. But if I do, everything unravels. The scandal. The investigation. The village torn apart on Christmas Day. And if you don't report it, a murderer walks free. I know that too. They stood in silence. Outside, the snow had stopped. Pale winter sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. There's something else, Henry said quietly. Something I haven't told anyone. Not even Dot. What? He turned to face her. His expression was haunted. 3 days ago, I saw Edgar in the churchyard. Near the old garden where the foxgloves grow in summer. He was digging. Digging? The ground was frozen solid. It must have taken tremendous effort. But he was digging. And when he saw me watching, he stopped. Covered the hole. And walked away without a word. Margaret felt the final piece slide into place. You knew, she said. You suspected something was wrong even before Thomas died. I suspected. I didn't know. Henry's voice cracked. And I told myself I was imagining things. That Edgar might be troubled, but he wasn't a murderer. I convinced myself to wait. To watch. To do nothing. And now Thomas is dead. Yes. Henry's eyes were wet. And I will carry that weight for the rest of my life. Margaret walked to him. Placed her hand on his arm. You couldn't have known what Edgar was planning. None of us could. Couldn't we? He told you himself that he couldn't let Thomas destroy him. The signs were there. I just refused to see them. Then help me see them now. Help me prove what happened. Help me bring the truth to light. Henry looked at her for a long moment. Then nodded slowly. What do you need? I need to talk to Beatrice Loomis. She knows more than she's telling. I saw it in her eyes this morning. And then I confront Edgar Finch. The post office was closed for Christmas. The sign on the door said so. But when Margaret knocked, Beatrice opened it anyway. I wondered when you'd come, Beatrice said. She led Margaret into the small parlor behind the counter. It smelled of ink and old paper and something else. Something sour. Fear. You know why I'm here. Yes. Beatrice sat in a straight-backed chair. Her hands trembled in her lap. I've been expecting this since I found the body. I knew someone would figure it out eventually. I just didn't expect it to be you. What did you do, Beatrice? I delivered a mince pie. The words hung in the air. Simple. Devastating. Tell me everything. Beatrice closed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was flat. Mechanical. The voice of someone reciting a nightmare. Edgar came to me 3 days ago. He was desperate. More desperate than I'd ever seen him. He said the Reverend was going to ruin him. Expose him. Send him to prison. He said his creditors were threatening him. That he had nothing left. That he couldn't see any way out. What did he ask you to do? He gave me a mince pie. Said it was a peace offering. An apology for all the arguments. He asked me to put it on the Reverend's desk in the vestry before the Christmas Eve service. Beatrice's voice cracked. He said Thomas would appreciate the gesture. That it might soften things between them. And you did it. I did it. Tears streamed down Beatrice's face. I thought I was helping. Mending a broken friendship. I had no idea, she broke off, sobbing. I had no idea what was in that pie. Margaret watched her carefully. Searching for deception. Finding only horror. Only guilt. When did you realize? This morning. When I found the body. When I saw the pie on the desk, half eaten. And I remembered Edgar's face when he gave it to me. The way he couldn't meet my eyes. The way his hands shook. Beatrice looked up. He used me, Mrs. Holloway. He used me to murder a man. And I helped him without even knowing. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? I've lived in this village my whole life. I know everyone's secrets. Everyone's sins. I knew Edgar was desperate. I knew Thomas was determined to destroy him. And I still took that pie and placed it on that desk without asking a single question. She buried her face in her hands. I am complicit. Whatever happens to Edgar, I am complicit in what he did. Margaret sat in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Beatrice. Look at me. Beatrice raised her head. Her eyes were red. Her face was blotched with tears. You made a mistake. A terrible mistake born of trust and good intentions. But you did not kill Thomas Whitmore. Edgar did. And now you have a choice. You can carry this secret forever, letting it poison you from the inside. Or you can tell the truth and begin to heal. The truth will destroy me. The truth will set you free. It always does. Even when it hurts. Beatrice stared at her. Then nodded slowly. What do I do? You come with me. We go to Edgar's cottage together. And we give him a chance to do the right thing. Edgar's cottage looked abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light burned in the windows. The snow on the path remained undisturbed, as if no one had come or gone since the previous night. Margaret knocked. The sound echoed across the frozen moors. No answer. She knocked again. Harder. Edgar. I know you're in there. Open the door. Silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Edgar Finch stood in the gap. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. His face was gaunt. His eyes were hollow. His clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk overnight. He saw Beatrice standing behind Margaret. And in that moment, something in his expression shifted. Resignation. Complete and absolute. You know, he said. Yes. He nodded slowly. Then stepped back, opening the door wider. You'd better come in, then. Both of you. It's time I told someone the truth. Visual CUE, interior of cottage. Cold. Dark. Single candle burning. Empty bottles everywhere. The cottage was freezing. The fire had burned out long ago. Edgar sat in his chair by the dead hearth, wrapped in a blanket that did nothing to stop his shivering. Margaret and Beatrice sat across from him. Waiting. I killed him, Edgar said. The words came out flat. Emotionless. The confession of a man who had already accepted his fate. I dug up the foxglove roots 3 days ago. Boiled them down to extract the digitalis. Put it in the mince pie and the bottle of sherry I left in the vestry. He laughed. A hollow, broken sound. Thomas always had a glass of sherry after evening services. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist. Why? Margaret asked. Why murder instead of running? Why kill instead of facing the consequences? Edgar's eyes met hers. And in that moment, she saw something she had not expected. Not evil. Not madness. Just pain. Decades of pain. Compressed into a single, terrible choice. You want to know why? His voice cracked. Because I was tired, Mrs. Holloway. Tired of running. Tired of hiding. Tired of waking up every morning with shame sitting on my chest like a stone. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The war took everything from me. My youth. My faith. My ability to feel anything except fear and guilt. I came home a ghost wearing a man's face. And for years, I tried to numb the pain. Drink. Gambling. Anything to stop the memories. And the money you stole. Desperation. Pure desperation. My creditors were threatening me. Men who don't make empty threats. I told myself I'd pay it back. I always told myself I'd pay it back. But the hole just kept getting deeper. And then Thomas found out. And then Thomas found out. Edgar's face twisted. He called me into his vestry last month. Sat me down like a child. Told me he knew everything. The gambling. The debts. The missing money. He said he was giving me until after Christmas to make a full confession to the parish council. And if I refused, he would go to the police himself. He could have shown mercy. Mercy? Edgar laughed bitterly. Thomas Whitmore didn't believe in mercy. He believed in justice. And his version of justice meant destroying me completely. My reputation. My freedom. Everything I had left. He fell silent. The candle flickered. Shadows danced on the walls. So I made a choice, he continued. A terrible choice. I told myself it would be quick. Painless. That Thomas would simply fall asleep and never wake up. I told myself I was doing him a kindness, sparing him the burden of his own righteousness. But that wasn't true. No. It wasn't true. Edgar's voice dropped to a whisper. I killed him because I was afraid. Because I was selfish. Because I couldn't face what I had become. And now, he looked at his hands. Now I have to live with what I've done. For however long I have left. Margaret stood. Edgar Finch. You will come with us to the village. You will confess to Constable Peterson. And you will accept whatever consequences follow. Edgar looked up at her. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Resistance, perhaps. Or the last embers of survival instinct. Then it faded. Yes, he said quietly. I suppose I will. He rose from his chair. An old man. A broken man. A murderer. But also, Margaret realized, a man who had finally stopped running. The village watched in silence as Edgar Finch was led across the green. Constable Peterson had arrived within the hour, summoned by Henry. He had listened to Edgar's confession with a face that grew paler with each word. Then he had produced a pair of handcuffs and spoken the formal words of arrest. Edgar Finch, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Reverend Thomas Whitmore. You will be transported to Lower Ashworth for processing and held pending trial. Edgar had not resisted. He had simply held out his wrists and let the cold metal close around them. Now he walked between two officers, his head bowed, his feet shuffling through the snow. The villagers had gathered on doorsteps and in windows, their faces a mixture of shock and sorrow and something that might have been relief. Margaret stood beside Dorothy and Henry, watching. I thought I'd feel satisfied, Dorothy said quietly. Seeing him caught. Seeing justice done. And do you? No. I just feel sad. For Thomas. For Constance. For Edgar himself, strange as that sounds. She wiped her eyes. He was a good man once. Before the war broke him. Good men can do terrible things, Henry said. When they're pushed far enough. When they see no other way. That's not an excuse. No. It's not. But it is an explanation. Edgar reached the constable's car. He paused at the door and turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Margaret. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Edgar spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the frozen green. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. For what? For seeing me. Not just what I did. But who I was before. And who I might have been, in a different life. He attempted a smile. It did not quite succeed. I think that matters. Even now. Perhaps especially now. Margaret nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. Edgar climbed into the car. The door closed behind him. And then he was gone, disappearing down the lane toward Lower Ashworth, toward trial, toward whatever fate awaited him. The crowd began to disperse. The drama was over. Life, with its ordinary rhythms, would resume. But Margaret stood still, watching the empty lane, thinking about justice and mercy and the terrible weight of secrets kept too long. A week had passed since Edgar's arrest. The village had slowly returned to normal. Or something resembling normal. The church had held a memorial service for Thomas Whitmore, conducted by a visiting vicar from Leeds. The pews had been full. The hymns had been sung. The eulogy had praised Thomas's years of service without mentioning the circumstances of his death. Constance had sold the vicarage. She was moving to Bath to live with her sister. Margaret had visited her the day before to say goodbye. "I'm grateful to you," Constance had said, pressing Margaret's hands in hers. "For finding the truth. Even though it hurt. Even though it changed everything. Will you be all right? Eventually." "I think so. I have my sister. I have my memories, the good ones anyway. And I have closure." Constance had smiled sadly. "That's more than many widows get." Now Margaret sat by the fire at Foxglove Cottage, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Dorothy was knitting. Henry was reading the newspaper. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the first hours of a new year. "The trial is set for March," Henry said, folding his paper. "Edgar will plead guilty. His solicitor says there's no point fighting it. The confession was too complete. What will happen to him? Life imprisonment, most likely. He's too old for the rope, and the circumstances are mitigating. The judge will take the war into account. The trauma. The desperation. Prison will kill him anyway," Dorothy said quietly. "A man like Edgar, locked up for the rest of his days. It's a death sentence in all but name." "Perhaps that's justice," Henry said. "Or perhaps it's just tragedy. I can't tell the difference anymore." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Dorothy set down her knitting and looked at Margaret. "How long are you staying?" The question Margaret had been waiting for. The question she had been asking herself every day since Christmas. "I don't know," she admitted. "I came for Christmas. I meant to leave after New Year. But..." Margaret looked around the cottage. The worn furniture. The crooked beams. The view through the window of the village green and the church steeple rising against the winter sky. "But something has changed," she said slowly. "Being here. Being part of something again. Feeling useful." She met her sister's eyes. "I spent 6 years alone in London, Dorothy. Alone in a flat full of memories. Alone with my grief. I thought I was surviving. But I was just existing. And now I feel alive again. For the first time since William died." She set down her tea. "I'd like to stay. Through spring. Perhaps longer. If you'll have me." Dorothy's face broke into a smile. The first genuine smile Margaret had seen since Christmas morning. "Have you? Maggie, this is your home. It always has been." She rose and crossed to her sister, taking her hands. "Stay as long as you like. Stay forever. This cottage is big enough for all of us." Henry folded his newspaper and grinned. "Thank goodness. I've been trying to convince Dot for weeks that you should stay. She was worried you'd find us too provincial after London." "Provincial is exactly what I need," Margaret said. "Provincial and peaceful and full of people I love." Dorothy embraced her. And for a long moment, the two sisters held each other, making up for decades of distance in a single gesture. 1 month later. At Foxglove Cottage. February 1954. A letter arrived in early February. The envelope was plain. The handwriting unfamiliar. Margaret opened it by the window, where pale winter sunshine was beginning to warm the glass. She read. "Dear Mrs. Holloway. Edgar Finch was tried and convicted last week. He will spend the remainder of his life in prison. I don't know whether that is justice or merely punishment. But it is, at least, an ending. I wanted to thank you. Without your persistence, without your questions, Thomas's death would have been recorded as natural causes. A murderer would have walked free. And I would have spent the rest of my days wondering whether my husband truly died the way the doctors said he did. The truth hurt. It hurt more than I expected. Learning that Edgar, a man I had known for decades, was capable of such an act. Learning that Thomas had driven him to it through rigidity and judgment. learning that secrets I never suspected had been festering in my own home for years. But the truth also healed. In knowing what happened, I can finally grieve. I can remember Thomas for who he truly was, flaws and all. And I can move forward without the weight of unanswered questions. I am settled now in Bath with my sister. The house is warm. The company is good. I am learning to be alone without being lonely. I hope we meet again someday. Until then, know that you have my gratitude. And my friendship, if you want it. With warmest regards. Constance Whitmore. Margaret folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. She looked out the window at the village she had once left behind. The green. The church. The cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. The path leading up to the moors, where the foxgloves would bloom again in summer. She thought about secrets. The weight of them. The damage they caused when held too long. She thought about Edgar Finch, sitting in a prison cell, paying for a moment of desperation that had cost a man his life. She thought about Thomas Whitmore, a man of rigid principles who had forgotten that mercy was also a virtue. And she thought about herself. A woman who had spent 6 years hiding from grief, only to find that running away solved nothing. Secrets are heavy things. We carry them thinking we are protecting others. But we are only protecting ourselves. And the weight, eventually, breaks us. The Reverend kept secrets. Edgar kept secrets. And in the end, the truth came out anyway. It always does. The only question is how much damage we allow along the way. Margaret turned from the window and walked to the fire, where Dorothy was making tea and Henry was reading yet another newspaper. She sat down in her chair. Her chair now. In her home. What are you thinking about? Dorothy asked. Truth, Margaret said. And the courage it takes to speak it. Heavy thoughts for a February morning. Perhaps. But necessary ones. Dorothy handed her a cup of tea. Strong. Milky. Perfect. The new vicar arrives next week, Henry said, looking up from his paper. Young fellow from Manchester. Very modern, apparently. Wants to start a youth group. The village will eat him alive, Dorothy said. Probably. But it will be entertaining to watch. Margaret smiled. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the smile reached all the way to her heart. Outside, the snow continued to melt. The first crocuses were pushing through the earth. Spring was coming. And Margaret Holloway was finally home. The end. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Leave a comment telling me which clue you caught first. And subscribe so you are here when the next cozy mystery drops. Harbolite Mysteries. Let the lantern guide you home. Next tomorrow on Harbolite Mysteries. A snowbound manor. A missing will. A family with more secrets than rooms. When a wealthy patriarch dies on Christmas Eve, his heirs gather for the reading of his will. But when the document is found to be missing, old grudges surface and new suspicions arise. Someone in this house knows where the will is hidden. Someone in this house will do anything to keep it that way. And someone in this house is about to become the next victim. Mistletoe over the manor. A 1 to 2 hour cozy mystery. Next tomorrow. Only on Harbolite Mysteries. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.